Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this PeaceTechTalk. We are connected here, a few of us from the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance. I move a little bit so you can see that behind me. And we are here for this 1 hour PeaceTechTalk dedicated to the use of data for refugees, data for peace, with a number of distinguished speakers. Some of them are actually here. We took the opportunity of asking some of the speakers in a training course that we've organized this week to stay with us for this talk, and we also managed to bring in distinguished speakers from other parts of the world. So first of all, this is part of this initiative called the Global Peace Tech Hub at the European University Institute. It's a recent initiative. Started the end of last year, and we have regular talks, and we are also working on a major annual conference next year. The idea is to analyze the many ways in which digital technology can be used for peace writ large, if you wish, including cohesion, prosperity, solidarity, the protection of human rights, right? And in doing this, we partner as the European University Institute with the University of Lucerne and with the New York University GovLab. And we have here with us as one of the speakers, Stefan Verhulst, who's the co-founder of the GovLab at NYU and our partner in the Global Peace Tech Hub. But how this is going to work today, we have several speakers. We have a lot of interest on this topic, and I think this will be a very interesting topic. We will start with a presentation by Olaf Osica, who's the Director of Strategy and Analysis at the City of Warsaw, but he's also affiliated with the College of Europe in Natolin in Poland. And we will ask him a little bit how the City of Warsaw is tackling what is indeed an unprecedented crisis in terms of an inflow of refugees that and in the peak moment actually increased the population of Warsaw by good 40%, right? So something that is difficult for a city to handle, right? But this is not just on how the city tackles problems through data, but also how data can be used for those people that have been moving into a different territory, right, over time. So we will ask not only Stefan, that I already mentioned, to give us some comments about this and interact with Olaf. We also have with us Mélanie Dulong de Rosnay. You should see her on screen by now, of CNRS and Centre for Internet and Société in France. And then we will have Bruno Lepri, we see him on screen from the Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento, another data scientist. And we are happy to add to the original lineup also Cameron Ashraf, who has visited today. So you see three different screens here, but we are actually Olaf, Cameron, and I in the same room. So at some point we will unveil the mystery, and we perhaps turn the laptops, and you see that we're actually very close to one another. And Cameron has come to join us for, and we see also Emmanuel Letouze from the Data Pop Alliance, and also working with Bruno in the Data Pop Alliance. And Cameron, I was saying, is an academic affiliated with Central European University, but also the Director of Human Rights at the Wikimedia Foundation and one of the co-founders of Access Now, that many of you, I would say all of you that are connected for a very obvious reason, know very well. So we are many. We have 1 hour and so I'd like to get started as quickly as possible. So I turn to Olaf. You will see me looking there because Olaf is actually that way and on at the table at which we are sitting. And Olaf, perhaps you can do the. Yeah. Okay. Yes. You just wait for me to. That's why we are in the same room. Wait for me to be finished, and then I will switch off my microphone. And so, Olaf, why don't you walk us through a little bit what has happened in the city of Warsaw and how you plan or you have already used data in order to tackle this crisis? So I give you the floor, and then I will ask the others to interact with you and give you comments.
Okay, hello everyone. Oh, now Andrea is here. Okay, now Andrea has turned off his mic. Hello again, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Very briefly, as you can well know, 24th of February, Poland actually witnessed, the biggest crisis in its history, refugee crisis in its history, and I guess one of the biggest in the world. So within actually a couple of weeks, the city got a few 100,000 refugees. They were coming through the border. As Andreas said, in the peak of the crisis, mid-March, we have 300,000 people, refugees, being in the city more than 3 days in a city which is nearly 2 million people. So you can see it was, between 10 and 15%. Altogether, there was 800,000 people coming through Warsaw. Like a transfer going from the east to the west. So it was really a very, serious, not only refugee crisis, but a very good just example, or how can you deal with that with the help of a lot of NGOs, business community, education, just everyone volunteers. So it was really a tough time. But since we are here just to talk about data, so let me say that the first thing which we when the crisis broke out, and the first thing which we need to know, of course, was how many people actually crossed the border, because the government decided simply to open up the border. They were just, letting people in without looking into documents, passports, whatever. So the first numbers we got actually were the numbers of the border crossings, and this is so far true. So if you would ask me a question, which I quite often being asked, how many people we have, I cannot tell you how many people we have. What I can tell you is what is the number of border crossings between Ukraine and Poland. And it's like, since the beginning of war, it's more than 4 million border crossings from Ukraine to Poland, but 2 million were also back. So one of the things which we started to at the very beginning of the crisis, and now let me share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay, and now I hope I can. Okay. Can you see the Power BI dashboard?
No, we can't.
Now you can?
Now we can.
Yes, you can. Okay, that's good. Okay. So one of the first things we started to do is, based on the data provided by the border guard, is simply just to look. This is what we still do. So this is the number of everyday crossings. This is for tomorrow, and we look at the netto inflow of people. So here you have, from the beginning of the crisis, as you can see, we have almost 2 million netto inflow of people coming to Poland. And of course, we don't know how many of them exactly just stayed in the country, how many of them went further for Schengen borders to Germany, Czechia and other states. What we actually, did know was how many, and here I show you another slide. So this is the number of, okay, it's not working here. Okay, so this is technology we're making, so probably there are some other problems. But anyway, just so we based on the number of crossings of the border, then we organized a system in which we actually were following, how many people was coming to the city by train, by private cars, or volunteers, municipal police. So we were basically counting them, trying to count how many of them were. So as you can see, we didn't have the numbers. We have some assessments, and the first thing when we get more detailed data was when we asked one of the biggest IT company, and they provide debit cards. So we asked them whether they could help us just to start counting people, and they look at the number of debit cards which they issued in Ukraine, and the number of debit cards which actually vanished from Ukraine and appeared in Warsaw and the adjacent units around Warsaw and the metropolis. So basically, we could see how many people using cards in Ukraine now are buying stuff, different kind of stuff in Warsaw and in the adjacent region. And this gave us the first number of 300,000 I mentioned just. So that was the scale of the challenge. We didn't know, however, how many of them were located in the city center, and how many of them were in other districts. We have 18 districts in Warsaw, and then with Metropolis we have more units. So actually, the other we also asked the telecom companies. They provided us with data. The problem was that when people were crossing the border, some of them were using roaming, so we could see how many, and perhaps maybe this will work. Okay, this will work. This is something we started to collect a few weeks ago. The problem was that some people were using roaming, and many people, actually a couple of hundreds of people, were simply handed out prepaid telecom cards, and because they were handed out those cards without any signature, it meant actually that we could not trace them because it's GDPR thing. Yeah? So that was the moment when we realized actually that although the telecom companies, they did have the number of logins to their network, they also could see the location of those people, how they travel, between different cities. They could not provide us with this because people simply did not sign anything like a contract, so they could not give us this data. So the situation changed when, in the mid of March, the government decided to start the registration process. Perhaps this slide will work better. Yes. So, and then we started actually just based on the number provided from the government. We started just to look at the Warsaw and the entire Poland. Just it's also not working. So it's probably something with the firewall. So we look at the number of people and the age structure, and we compare it to the Warsaw to Poland, and this is how we came to a number that 10% of nationwide registrations are in Warsaw. So basically, we calculated. Yes, we did a lot of triangulation. So we came up to the idea that it must have been around 10% of people who are in Poland are actually just in Warsaw in different districts. That was the data we used also for our education, especially education system, because we have 16,000 of Ukrainian kids in our education systems, from kindergartens to primary schools and to high schools. So we collected. Then, of course, we get data from different kind of allowances, which the government is offering. Also, is not working. Sorry. I don't know why. So the government decided just to pay like a small amount of money for those who hosted Ukrainian refugees, because one of the phenomenon of this crisis is that we don't have any refugee camps. We actually have only 2,000 beds which are available for Ukrainian refugees, which is nothing compared to the number of people who came to the city. So once we have the number of how many people actually apply to the government with for this money, so we can also calculate it how many people we have. Yes, and I can go along with the story, but the point is actually that we although we assumed kind of that when people are crossing the border, there won't be any problem simply to know how many of them are and how they are traveling. In reality, it turned out actually that there was nothing like fixed number. There is an inflow of people, and there is no one way you can really count them and trace how they are moving around the country. So we collected as many data as possible, came to all sources, asked all companies that some of them would like to cooperate, some didn't like to cooperate with us because data is not only sensitive because of GDPR, but also data is, of course, money, and there is a lot of IT companies who simply use data as their core business. But basically, and my conclusion is that we and therefore I'm showing you this dashboard because based on those different kind of sources, of course, we check the quality of data, and we build first of all we build very simple Excels and find people who input this data so we can have this dashboard. Now we can trace day after day what is changing, what is going on the borders. So we could see if there is a netto outflow, then we see that we are the safe side. If there is a netto inflow to Poland, then we can expect, and it's like if there is a 3 days when we see that the numbers are growing, then we can imagine that this wave takes around between 24 and 48 hours just before the wave from the eastern border reaches Warsaw, and now we can easily, track and see how many people, more or less, yes, we have, how they behave, how many of them are in the city proper, how many of them are in the metropole. We know from the percentage how many kids we have, how many adults. We know that we have basically, over 90% are women, of course, 46%, around 46% are kids. so we can build, so we can prepare for the autumn, for the new school year. So this is how we actually work, and we created out of the chaos. We created a very simple, BI. It's a Power BI tool which helps the mayor and the deputy mayors of the city to look and what's going on, where we are, and we can also compare Warsaw to other cities in Poland and the country nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. That's first snapshot of what data can do and on how difficult it is to get a hold of data in order to basically enter and manage a crisis, if you wish, right? So your perspective is more the perspective of the crisis management mode in the city. Now we will hear later perhaps from Manuel and Bruno for sure, but perhaps also from Cameron, and who knows, maybe also from the other speakers, the perspective of what can be done with data to support refugees and perhaps to protect human rights in the situation in which they currently are in. And one that can certainly manage both sides of these issues is Stefan. So Stefan, I don't know if you have questions for Olaf or you want to comment on what you heard until now.
No, and again, impressive work, Olaf. Congratulations with the progress made, given the fact of the scale of the problem indeed, and the agility on how you have managed to establish that kind of intelligence that then really can support humanitarian response. And I think there are a few key elements that, from my point of view, are important to reinforce. First of all, is that without data, it's very hard to manage and anticipate what the needs might be. And I think what you have here is clearly a better way to then inform decisions and allocations of resources as well. One question I would have, perhaps Olaf, is how actually do you turn the data intelligence into actually decision intelligence, right? Because quite often you do have a fragmentation of decision makers that need to be coordinated, right? So you mentioned education, you mentioned housing, you mentioned specific gender needs, and so on and so on. And quite often, especially within cities, but also, of course, at the national level, there is not really always a coordination among all the actors that can act upon the data or that need the data as well. So that's the first area. Is really about great to have data to inform decisions, but how do you then translate the data in ways that decisions can be made? The other reflection is really about indeed access to non-traditional data sets. I think that's the real opportunity, but also the real challenge and headache in the current environment. As you know, we have an initiative together with IOM and with the European Commission called Big Data for Migration Alliance, where we really have focused on how do we actually unlock non-traditional data, such as telecom, but also you already mentioned credit card data, but also social media data. I mean, it would be interesting. Anyway, can you have access to search data, for instance, because it would be clear that anyone searching in Ukrainian for a particular kind of country might be a proxy and indication that they probably are likely to go to that country, for instance, right? So that's based upon what happened during the Syria crisis, where actually researchers could have access to search data, and anyone searching in Arabic in Turkey for Greece was a proxy that they were likely to go to Greece, for instance, right? And so there's a lot of potential here with regard to non-traditional data. But again, as already was mentioned, we are not ready as a society, right, to have access to this data, both in terms of the legal framework. And again, there is a lot of confusion basically on what GDPR can and cannot do. And quite often, it's up to the European Data Protection Supervisor to step in and clarify. And my question is here, what's the European Data Protection Supervisor doing with regard to helping you, Olaf, as it relates to clarifying what can and cannot? Because to a large extent, data holders are quite often using GDPR also to, anyway, not in bad intent, but just from a risk-averse kind of position to actually not collaborate as well. The other challenges, and again, that would be a question to Olaf, is of course, how do you even know who to talk to within organizations that might have data that could be important for informing the refugee situation here? And in many cases, many situations that we work on in, that turns out to be a really headache, is that actually no one within the organization that holds data that could be relevant has the authority or the mandate to even engage with actors like you, Olaf, to start figuring out how do we make data available. And so that means that we need to really develop a new function, such as what we call data stewards within organizations, i.e. organizations that have data that could be helped for instance, humanitarian relief, should actually have a function that can, in a more agile way and responsible way and systematic way, respond to solicitations for data. And then the last thing I will reflect on, anyway, and I had many other elements that I would touch upon, but I don't want to dominate this conversation here, is of course that we need to also be sensitive to the migrants and the refugees themselves with regard to how we use data, right? And so we started an initiative, and actually we had a conference last week in Switzerland where we focused on the concept of digital self-determination. And how do you actually provide a certain sense of self-determination among the refugees on how their data is used and how you ultimately get that social license for the use of the data. Obviously, you already mentioned, Olaf, consent is not going to do it here because first of all, they are already in a situation of distress. Secondly, there's like not really an informed choice here with regard to sharing data if you're at the border. And so we really need to come up with a better way to develop a social license where we then might have, anyway, key representatives, but more importantly, policies in place before a crisis happened on how you go about using data that impacts people's lives in a radical way. Because if you start using the data to determine who is in and who's out, then obviously that's a real aspect of human liberty and human agency, and we need to come up with a better way to actually monitor that as well. So these are just a few reflections to get started. Obviously, data in a situation like the one that we are in right now, where we have a war, has many other functions as well, right? In addition to monitoring refugees, it's also about how do you start using data to actually manage the root cause of of migration, in this case, conflict. And I think there's a lot of potential there as well that we need to start exploring. And that's, of course, what the idea is behind the PeaceTech kind of initiative as well, which is to really become smarter about the full plethora of opportunities and challenges as it relates to the use of data in towards peace building and humanitarian relief. So I'm going to stop here. Olaf, just a few reactions from my end, and I'm sure you have probably a lot more to add, but just to get us started.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. I think you certainly get a chance to come back later in the conversation, although we're almost halfway, so we need to go a little bit speedier. I certainly would want to hear from you whether you think, as you advise the European Commission on B2G data sharing, on whether the possibility for public authorities to access this data in times of emergency or for reasons of public interest could be in the future a way to at least partly solve this problem and eliminate some of the transaction costs that otherwise typically emerge in times of emergency. So I want to move to, I will ask Olaf to keep the replies to Stefan's comment in mind. I want to move to Melanie to see what's her take on this and what she learns from this situation and this story based on her work.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for the opportunity. Stefan, for your very insightful first comments and questions, and of course, Olaf for sharing this very impressive experience and all the actions you tried to take to cope with the situation and help try to help people. I've been trying in order to prepare this conversation to look at a few articles, a few research questions of the literature in order to know how to best govern data of and for humanitarian purposes. Because they are, as it was said, very, very specific data. And for instance, research purposes were mentioned, and it reminded me of the European guidelines for fair data. On the one hand, they have to be as open as possible to foster the reusability and accelerate research, but at the same time, they should be as close as possible to safeguard the privacy of the data subject. And indeed, these data subjects are very vulnerable because they carry everything. And in this life of as researcher Dana Diminescu qualified as connected migrants, they have all of their capital in the phone, the bank card, the passport, the biometric information, all the relationships with family, friends, professional, and it makes them very vulnerable, because it already happens that migration geolocalization data was used by European governments to deny asylum for Middle East and African asylum seekers. So there is a real threat in data collection and processing, which would go beyond the humanitarian purpose. Also, all the risk of data colonialism, which several researchers have been identifying, and you also pointed to the fact that these data are also captured by private company to extract value. And I would like to conclude with citing the work of two colleagues who are born. Who have been working with Russian and with Ukrainian people. First, one is called Grigory Asmolov, and he has been working on citizen platforms and emergency. And he noticed that when citizens are able to participate directly in the definition of how the data is going to be used, it has been very beneficial. And finally, Ksenia Ermoshina, she wrote a paper entitled "Is there an app for everything?" and working with also vulnerable person in tools for civic help and participation. And she noticed that what really matters is to include from the beginning of the design of any process, corpus collection, development, absolutely include the public. So, of course, to avoid techno-solutionism, but also to make sure that the categories are designed in a way which is taking into account the people who own the problems, who are targeted. Otherwise, they may not use or identify, and also, of course, there may be risks about which we haven't thought. So
thank you very much, Melanie. These are all very useful additions to the debate, because as I told everybody, we want to explore both sides, right? What comes from Olaf is a city that needs to manage the crisis, but also what are the safeguards and the protections that need to be, and perhaps the collective intelligence that can be mobilized in support of the situation of those refugees, and also their well-being, and also the protection of their fundamental rights. So we're going towards that end. And someone who's seen both sides, because you try to implement that on the ground already in the past, are certainly Emmanuel and Bruno, because you already worked on the data for refugees in the case of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, right? So it's good to perhaps start from Emmanuel, if you agree, and then go to Bruno on perhaps and having an account of what are the lessons learned from that experience, and what you think could be done in this case for Ukrainian refugees in Poland and also in neighboring countries. So maybe I give you the floor to start with, Emmanuel.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. To join. So the reason is I was driving from Spain to France for a long time, and I'm mentioning this not to mention this randomly, but because it gave me a lot of time to think about what I was going to say and contribute. Also, given the panel, it also reminded me of the freedom of movement. I mean, the freedom to just move from one place in Spain to a place in France, which other European citizens do not have right now. And so and also reminding me, I put some gas in the car, of course, and it cost 100 euros to fill the tank. And I was thinking, how much of that is Russian oil, because the ban hasn't been put in place. And so I was trying to get some perspective on what I was going to, what I was thinking and what I was going to say about that, besides or beyond the usual, well, we can use data to manage, and we need data to make decisions, and I was also reflecting on the past 10 years of what we're all in the data revolution. So 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we had the earthquake in Haiti, and then we had Ebola, and then we did the data for development challenge in Ivory Coast and Senegal, and then there was COVID, and then so the point is, I feel that maybe we keep having a bit of the same discussions, and I think we have to be a bit frustrated by that, or even maybe a bit angered by that. And in that sense, I echo completely Stefan's comment about, can we also look at the root causes? So the root causes, I mean, what had been happening in Russia for years was not news to anyone. However, no one predicted that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. If you look at the Economist predictions for 2022, there was no mention of that, the same way there was no mention of COVID 2 years before, even in December 2019. So my first point is, these things are very unpredictable. And for all the data and the predictive capabilities that we have to remain very humble at what we've achieved and what we can do with data. But at the same time, we have to go also more demanding of what we can do with data. We cannot just do what we've done with Bruno. And I'm happy that we did it. Stefan does a lot of great work. We do good work. I think we all try our best, but still, we live in this world where we swim in data, we swim in AI and technology, and people are starving, and there are conflicts everywhere. And so sometimes I want to tell myself, like, what are we doing, and why does this keep happening, and for how long are we going to do data for refugee challenges or data for development challenges and whatnot? And so maybe just in closing, to answer your question, I think so the data for refugee challenge that we organized 3 years ago was trying, maybe to Melanie's point, to try and be a bit more participatory, to get kind of like problem owners on the table, to try to use fine-grained data, so credit card transactions and telecom data. To telecom data in particular, to understand social interaction, so to have a finer, better picture of human reality and be able to respond to needs. Also, as Stefan mentioned, we know that we don't have the systems in place. Even after 10 years, the legislations are not in place, the cultures are not in place, there's no privacy preserving way. I mean, there are privacy preserving techniques, privacy enhancing techniques, they're being used. The UN does that, we tried with OPAL, etc. But it's not, kind of like at scale. So there's a very long way to go. But really the point I would like to get across is, can we use data to really change values, to change what energy we use, how much, where it's coming from, to not pander to oligarchs that come from all around the world, so that we don't have, or we have fewer wars as we have right now. I think that would be, and I'll leave it there. It's obviously a very big question, but to try and zoom out a little bit and look at where this is coming from and what is going to be the impact on sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and the looming food crisis and famines and instability that are coming up in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. And so we can fix that with the data in the short term. We can use AI prediction models, etc. But we have to fix the governance. I mean, we have to fix the deep root causes that are deeply, deeply political. Thank you.
So it's data so powerful, and it's this potential so deeply untapped. This is one of the questions. And in the case of the data for refugees, perhaps Bruno, you can help us in describing a little bit what you have done and what perhaps lessons could you have for the situation that will now, for example, Olaf face in terms not only of having to manage the city, but also having to ensure the well-being of the refugees that have arrived in Warsaw.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit, I think, echoing both Manu and Stefan before. So the thing is that, when we thought and designed the data for refugees, that was 3 years ago. So the idea was really try to be the most connected with the needs of the refugees. So one of, for example, of the asset that we have in organizing the challenge was having, for example, TechFugees, that is a fantastic organization that really work with refugees. We try also to be very detailed, so we look at the different problem of refugees. So it was we organized a challenge that was tackling several aspects. So the health problem, the labor problem, the education problem. We try to involve in some, it was a little bit less easy, also data that came from the public, so from Turkey, from the public, not only from private company like the telco that opened to us the data. So I think it was a process that learned a lot from the previous one. The data challenge done in Senegal, in Ivory Coast. But again, at the end, the result that we have was more a result of knowledge. So the ability to move from knowing something to do something was something that was not solved. Maybe this was not maybe the goal of the challenge. So it could be considered a little bit too naive and maybe too much, considering that we changed the way of doing, but we have very interesting results. So one of the results that we have, for example, on the health aspect was how we organize the refugees to avoid epidemic outbreak. Also, what you usually have is that you put refugees in refugee camp, and you think that in this way the hosting population is safe or has no health problem. Well, this is completely the opposite, because the possibility of having an outbreak there and then a spillover in the hosting population is very, very high. This was a very nice contribution from a social point of view that was also changing a little bit the mind how health authority organized the things. But again, it was very disconnected then to act. So I think refugee camps are still there. usually you feel as a public authority more safe if you put all the refugee in the same place instead of having them really integrated with the hosting population. So I think this was an aspect. I think so. The first question that one of the questions that Stefan raised. So how you having the data that, for example, Olaf showed, you can coordinate the different policymaker, the different offices, the different authorities of the city of Warsaw, for example, or other European city that have to deal with this crisis, to take decision that are informed decision. This is, I think, is one of the very important aspects. As well, also being a person that build predictive model, I think there is still a lot of doing that. So if we look back to COVID, for example, we realize that artificial intelligence doesn't serve a lot. So it was almost useless. So the type of methodology that we use are the epidemiological modeling that was around since more here than the new revolution of AI and deep learning and so on. And also, again, our methodology and epidemic modeling that with some example, good example, one is a friend like Alex Respignani or others, so are really trying to use alternative and novel sources of data, but this is not really a solved issue. So how this good amount and enormous amount of data are helping the modeling and the understanding very well. So there are a lot of problems. So both in science and again, more in the policy making, in the policy government action, I think.
Andrea, I think you're muted.
Andrea, you are muted.
Andrea, we can't hear you.
You are muted, Andrea.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Oh, good. Well, I think one of the things that I took away from this that might be a bit of a different angle is a bit outside of the data that's been gathered, and thinking about the actual data about the people that might have been generated for them or generated. These are going to be refugees. Some of them are going to have been individuals of prominence or well-known. And these entries, are out there, for example, on Wikipedia or elsewhere in news articles. And then this information, can be also used to target these individuals that are out in different countries. I'll give you an example of Afghanistan, where we had lots of, and also, in Russia, where there's lots of, for example, data out there about, activist groups, individuals who are working on different cases and so on, prominent campaigns. And then when you have a crisis like that, that data actually then becomes information that can be used to target, harass, isolate, intimidate individuals. So then you might want to consider taking steps to protect that data. But then the problem is when you try to actually protect data in some way, you actually then erase people's history. You erase the history. So in some ways, as I was listening to this, I was thinking that this is, of course, a management issue, and a humanitarian issue, but also an issue of this data is their history, and what actually happens with this data from a historical perspective. What happens from in terms of data protection perspective in these sorts of situations where we can think a little bit outside of the crisis, and also in terms of what does this data represent and what does it mean, and how are we relating relating to it. So I know it's a bit of perhaps a different take, but it was inspired by some of the situations that I've seen where choices have to be made behind, using data, protecting data for refugee and refugee situations, deleting data, but at the risk of compromising people's history, the integrity of what they've been through, and also potentially risking their further security. Because as we have seen in many refugee crises, data about refugees can be used is actually used against them to target them. So it also opens up another, this whole other can of worms, also in terms of, data protection, preservation, and so on. As we know, if you've ever looked through some of the Holocaust history, some of the data that is there actually can be, in a way, even more affecting than some of the art when you look at these manifests and things that you would look at. So just to add a bit of a different take.
Good, Cameron. And as it happened to you, in the Wikimedia context or in Access Now, in the case of Ukrainian crisis, that some individuals you've spotted that could be targeted in terms of their opinions, right? So that is something to be taken into account, into how deeply you go into collecting data, anonymizing data, and reusing data for purposes that are actually for public interest. But obviously, you are handling data that are quite sensitive, and also individuals, data subjects that could become, as refugees themselves, very vulnerable, as Melanie was saying, and easily targeted as they are fleeing their country. So, yeah, Cameron, go ahead.
And I will share one thing actually related to that, is because when we think about protecting individuals, we also have to think about, refugees, very vulnerable populations. The point that the people who see the data are points of vulnerability as well. One of the most interesting cases I worked on with Access was when we had an agent from another state who had positioned themselves in the UNHCR pipeline in order to get data on because this was a country that was very, a UNHCR station, which was very popular with refugees, political dissidents from a certain country, and they were getting eye on the data of everybody who was coming in. And so it's also who is looking at the data, and how do you know that they're acting with integrity as well. That's unfortunately a bit of a downer to talk about.
Thank you very much, Cameron. I want to turn back to Olaf. I know that Stefan wants to say something. We have a little over 10 minutes to go, and I'd like a little bit to focus on, since Olaf is one of our guests today, it's indeed a sort of an ideal question as to what can data science, what can the data scientists, what can data governance do from now on top of what you've managed brilliantly to do in the city of Warsaw, right? From all the perspectives that you heard, and responding to the several questions and suggestions that you've received from the speakers.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the comments and questions. Well, I guess to cut a long story short, I think there are two problems. I mean, the one is that, well, first of all, you have to know why you need this data, because you have two extreme situations. One is when you have no data, and the other one we have so much data from all sources. Yes, and personally, I do prefer when I have little data, so I can just focus and interpret. Then when I have a lot of data, because people tend to believe in numbers, although they mostly do not understand those numbers. Yes, they don't know what the numbers stand for. Yes, and the problem we have many times, when we get telecom is a very good example. Just people are convinced that when you have data from telecom, that basically tells you just how many people are there. Yes, and might be true when you have and when you research the city, so you see that every week, every day there is a certain inflow of people. So different time of the day. But with this crisis, actually, we had a long conversations with a telecom company, how actually just what a roaming logging stand for. Just as it just you have a parent and you have a kid or two kids. Yes, so today, so everyone has smartphone or not. Then we have four companies. Yes, so you have different market share. Yes, then smartphones, they have two slots. So they can put just, the Ukrainian card and the Polish prepaid card. So how do we count it? Yes. So we spend a lot of time actually. And in the end, we decided that we do not take the numbers, although we get the numbers from telecom, but we look at the trend. So we just want to know whether the trend is going up or down, because we cannot really just, take those numbers and say, okay, this is the number of people we have in city proper and adjacent regions. And if I go with that, I mean, people immediately forget, and they will start using this, numbers just and telling different stories just on that. Yes, so that's number one. The second thing is that it's very important that, well, because we live in democratic countries, yes. So I mean, there is no way to have those Chinese kind of solutions when you put sensors all over the places. Yes, we're kidding that just the best solution would be if every refugee has a GPS. And then we would just, that would be great. Just we could just see, how many of them are and how do they, they transfer just across the country. This is not happening for obvious reasons. Yes, so I guess we have to rely on first of all on our own data. Like in the case we're talking about local government. Yes, so we have a very micro perspective actually, because I'm not interested. I started with big numbers, but then the questions are how many beds we should have in our accommodation centers, how many kids we may have in nurseries, so it's a very kind of a business approach. Yes, you really have to know the exact numbers to be ready to prepare the physical space, all the services. Yes, and we have sensors when it comes to public transportation, so we could trace and see actually just was the increase of people are using transportation, although we offered the free transportation for Ukrainians. So it would be easier for us actually just to force them to pay for tickets. But we decided just to give them 3 months of free transportation. So we're using sensors, yes, in metro stations, just in some other places. But then actually, and this is the other, kind of a set of a questions. So what do you do with this data? And what Stefan just asked. I think, well, the first thing is that when you get a grip on data, and my office, we report directly to the mayor. Yes, so it was for me quite easy because the mayor decided just whatever data is, they have to go to me, and it's me to decide what is the quality of the data and whether this data can be a basis for any decisions. But the basic issue is, and here I will just again try to for a moment just share my screen because the dashboard, I reloaded the dashboard and it seems that it works now. Okay. Okay, so the key thing you do with data is basically, there are two things. The first, you see the trend I mentioned, but also it's about your resources. As you can see here, for instance, this is the dynamics of the registration process for Poland, Mazowieckie region and Warsaw. That was a moment when we had long discussions, how many registration points we should have in the city, how many people we should hire extra just to, to operate those registration centers. And with this data, just, day after day, we could see actually that, first of all, the trend is decreasing. So the crisis, is getting more or less stabilized. And then we can de-invest. So we could close certain registration centers and direct those people to other, duties. So the same is with the accommodation centers. Yes, this is the data for Warsaw. So every day we see how many free beds we have. Historically, this is the 69%. So that was, this is for today number, and historically, the number was much higher. So this is less than we have capacity. And again, when we see that the wave was coming, that there were more inflows, then there was simply just in the meetings twice a day, deciding just whether we can just close certain reception points, or we should just invest and increase number of beds. So I think it's a very, it's like with the business when you just you want to follow the market and you see what's going on. So, and these are the main points. Whenever I show this dashboard, people say, well, it seems quite easily and simple, and it is, but to get from the day one when you have nothing but just just numbers and inflow of people to a situation when you can really see what's coming and what is the trend. So how can you manage your resources? It's very important. And this is for decision making, for the evidence-based decision making. This is the most important thing. And the last point on GDPR and big companies, non-traditional data. The problem with GDPR is it's not so much that some people are reluctant to share data with you. It's simply that when you talk with big corporations and their legal departments, if there is a 1% risk that they can breach GDPR, they say no, forget. Yes, they don't even want to engage in any sort of dialogue because it's going to be costly for them. Yes, so the problem is, and this is what I would expect, just both the government and especially just the European Commission, simply to clarify. Yes, when we have a state of emergency, that they know, for instance, that they can share certain data for us because there is a state of emergency. Yes, so they can feel that they are secure on the legal side, because that was one of the key problems. I mean, both with the external companies and also within the city when we're trying to use, whether there is an increase in, water usage, whatever it is. Yes, we're looking at all sorts of data that would indicate just, that the city is growing. Yes, and we have more problems than with geolocation. The problem of GDPR was one of the key. Yes, even if it wasn't really, people are kind of, told that, if there is a slight risk that they can breach GDPR, they say, no, I'm not going to share the data with you. And I think this needs to be clarified, especially for a situation like we have with the refugee crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Olaf. So I think this leads us back perhaps to Stefan, who wanted to intervene already before. We have only a few minutes to go, so I'll just ask you whether, what are your reflections on this and what you think should be done to bring data forward and make them more useful to handle both crisis management and the situation of refugees.
Well, again, in a huge topic in 4 minutes, so I'm not gonna go. But I think, first of all, I think clearly we need to do better and with regard to the governance framework, and actually clarify before a crisis happens and have a mandate to actually access privately held data or non-traditional data. But I think it also, and I think I liked all of what you said, is that it's important to know for what you need data for. And quite often, in addition to the challenge of access to data, quite often the problem is in formulating the questions that matter for the situation that one is in, right? And it also relates a little bit to Emmanuel, which with regard to the root causes, are we actually focusing on the right questions here, right? That matter, or are we just focusing on the ones that we can answer at a time of crisis? And I think investing more on what is it that we need to know, right, to inform decision making. By the way, who are the decision makers that need to know, and why, anyway, do they then not act upon the insights that are generated? So the demand side is important to express as well. And that, by the way, would also inform more trust if we know what the purpose is for which one actually seeks the data. Because quite often it's like, oh, they need data and we don't know how they're going to use it. And there is no accountability that they actually are using it for that purpose and not other purposes, which then goes back to Cameron, is that it's easy to actually weaponize data in a situation like that. And that could be, anyway, negative outcome as well. And then from wondering, Olaf, who funds all this, right? And I think data, meaning in humanitarian spaces, it's like there's a lot of funding that goes to response, but then no funds that goes to data. And we saw that with COVID as well, right? Is that God knows how many trillions have been made available. How much money has been made available to invest in data infrastructures? Little, right? It's a travesty, frankly, because now we have all this money invested in response, and we can't even monitor how it is being spent because we didn't invest in the data infrastructure. So that's another big element that we need to just bring to the table as well, is that if we want to do this systematic, sustainable, and responsible, we actually need to invest in it, right? And who is going to do this?
Thank you very much, Stefan. I think we will need to wrap up, and as you can see, in 1 hour, we've only scratched the surface of a very, very important and delicate debate. The way to wrap up this is very difficult, of course, but we've realized that not only data can be a very powerful tool if properly used, but it has a problem of, first of all, availability, and there are some policy measures that are being adopted to increase the availability of data. It has a problem of governance. It has a problem of compatibility across government. It has a problem of managing and using the data properly. It is a problem of protection and perhaps the need to invest in infrastructure and in privacy-enhancing technologies to enable the data to flow with less concerns in that respect. it is a problem of skills and competences to handle the data. And this is the data stewardship skills that that Stefan was referring to. And finally, it has a problem of narrative in the sense that it's very easy when the moment comes to evoke the power of data, do something. You data scientists that say that data is so powerful, but then if you fail to invest in the infrastructure and in preparedness to have the data and use them properly when the time comes, and also invest financially in creating that infrastructure and in creating that type of preparedness that is needed, well, it is impossible to then imagine that the data scientists can transform themselves into wizards and magicians, right? So I think these are a little bit the controversies and the difficulties of today's use of data science for humanitarian purposes and for crisis management purposes. I hope that in this hour we managed to uncover some of them, unveil some of them. We've seen people that act on the ground to do this, be that for the protection of human rights or to manage crisis in city. We've seen data scientists that try to formulate the right questions and untap the potential of data to answer them in a meaningful way. So from Florence, European University Institute School of Transnational Governance, I want to thank Olaf Osica, Stefan Verhulst, Mélanie Dulong de Rosnay, Emmanuel Letouzé, Bruno Lepri, and Cameron Ashraf for having spent this hour with us. And we'll see you after the summer break with the next Peace Tech Talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.